Welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. Today we talk to Professor Emma Boyland on food marketing and behavioral impact. Emma is a professor of food marketing and child health at the University of Liverpool. Her main research interests are in the effects of food promotion on children's food preferences, choices, and ingestive behavior. Specifically, she is interested in quantifying the extent and nature of food advertising via television, news media, and other sources, example, outdoor advertising, and elucidating the effects of branding activity, example, use of promotional characters, on children's responses to advertising. In addition, she is interested in determining the role of situational factors such as hunger states and both intrinsic, such as tendencies to eat in the absence of hunger or cue responsiveness, and extrinsic, example, parental control, independent spending power, that mediate factors on children's intake and request responses to food marketing. Please remember to share this episode, subscribe to Alimentos y Emociones podcast both on YouTube and Spotify, leave a comment and press the notification button to help us grow this channel. Also remember that on Spotify you can leave us some stars and help us to grow and position this community as a way of disseminating science. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. Today, I'm going to talk to Dr. Professor Emma Boyland on food marketing and its impact on behavioral weight management. So, this is a hot topic. Emma, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is, as you know, in Mexico, we're really quite, involved in all this. We have done quite a lot of work regarding this, but there's always so much to do. And I'd like to just sort of start by asking you how you got into this field, because I think it's just, I always think, what on earth led us to get where we are, in our work and in our research?
Yeah, I'll try to give you the brief version because it's a bit of a convoluted story. My undergraduate degree was actually in molecular biology, so I was really interested in genetics and forensics and all that line of work. And then I found that during my undergraduate studies, I actually gained a little bit of weight. I wasn't eating the well-balanced home-cooked meals anymore, and I was drinking a bit too much alcohol and all these sorts of things. And I went to some commercial weight management service to help me kind of get back to the healthy weight I'd been before. I think I was still a healthy weight, but I just, I wasn't so comfortable. So I wanted to lose a tiny bit of weight, and I was just interested to see the differences. So I was done in 2 months. I was back to the weight that I'd been at before. I was eating much better. I was physically active. And there were people attending that service who had been going for months and years, and we're really struggling to shift any weight at all. And we're coming out of those meetings and then going straight to a kind of hot food takeaway after the meeting. And it was curious to me how I could kind of, I guess, motivate myself or make those changes relatively easily. And they obviously were struggling to do so. And I kind of got interested in, is that something internal to me? Is that something to do with the environment that they're living in, their life in terms of their work pattern and so on? What is it that's driving those differences in how we manage our weight and so on? So I ended up looking up who does eating behavior research around here, and Liverpool came up as a good centre for that. Got in touch with people there, and one of the psychologists there had just been looking for a kind of an external food cue. They'd done a lot of work in terms of the internal cues that are driving what we eat and how much we eat. And they were looking for a kind of a relevant external food cue to use in a study, and they selected a television food advert and ran a small project with students and found that young children ate more after they'd seen the food adverts compared to non-food adverts, and kind of thought, there's something here. So, we started building on that.
Little
And,
did you know, little did you know what was going to happen to your life.
Absolutely, yeah, that became the whole focus of my career, and I'm still doing it now.
So where does the UK sort of stand on sort of food marketing right now? Because it has been kind of really up and down over the last couple of months, just reading the news. Where are you sort of in that? You know, how much legislation is there? What's going on?
Well, the current status of our legislation is that we're using the rules that were brought in around 2007, so that there are restrictions on what can be advertised on television around programming dedicated to children, but also popular with children, so where children make up a certain proportion of the audience. And there are also self-regulatory rules applying to online media as well, where the onus is on the marketer and the advertiser to not place their product, if it's unhealthy, according to the nutrient profile model, in spaces that are particularly popular with children or where children are likely to see it. We have had a promise from the government that they will tighten both of those restrictions, so to introduce a 9 p.m. watershed on television so that nothing deemed unhealthy using HFSS according to our nutrient profile model would be able to be shown on TV before 9 p.m. and also sort of mandatory government-led restrictions on online marketing across a number of different platforms, including influencers, in-game advertising, social media, and so on, for any companies that operate within the UK. So it doesn't matter if they're based in the UK or not, if they have a kind of UK operating arm of their business or they sell products in the UK, for example, they would be subject to those rules.
But that kind of like was sort of held back, wasn't it, a month ago or more or less, or a couple of months ago?
Yeah, the original implementation date was end of 22. That then got pushed to the beginning of 2023 and has now been delayed for a further year to 2024. And there are concerns that although the new rules have been put into law, that the implementation date will become kind of just keep getting pushed back and it will never actually come to fruition, because we enter a period building up towards a general election where we may change governments, or even if we don't, the kind of priorities change around that kind of time and move away from things like public health policies to more kind of, what's going to win votes at the ballot box type policies. So there are concerns that, the legislation has sounded so kind of pioneering, may never actually happen. But for now, we will have to try to remain optimistic that January 24 is when these things will happen.
Well, that is, I don't know, that there's still a lot of optimism to be held.
Possibly not, but I think even just the fact that we had that conversation is an improvement from where we were. For a long time, we still had to keep making the case that food marketing was harmful and that it was an issue and it was affecting diets and it should be part of an obesity prevention strategy. Whereas I think now it's fairly well established that food marketing is part of that mix, and it's just, how can we do this effectively? And obviously there's lots of pushback from the food industry and so on, but
yes.
Identifying proportionate measures across both that we can work with to kind of make incremental progress in developing a food environment that's both physically and online is conducive to a healthy diet.
I mean, obviously your focus has been on children and adolescents, but the impact is not just on children, it's also in adults and everybody. And so you've just done this. I mean, you've published 2 systematic reviews this year. So one is the associations of food and non-alcoholic beverage marketing with children and adolescents and how that impacts sort of eating behaviors and health. Would you like to sort of just give us a little run through that? And
sure.
So
there's 2 reviews that are both part of the World Health Organization's development of new guidelines. So you'll remember the 2010 recommendations set of recommendations for restricting food and beverage marketing to children. And the work we published this year is part of kind of updates of those evidence reviews to support that guideline development process. So yeah, one is looking at what do we know, what's the latest evidence in terms of impact of marketing, associations of marketing with the outcomes of interest across behavioural and health outcomes. So it's looking to capture anything that was published since the last big review that was in 2009. So it's really kind of just over a 10-year period. But of course, digital food marketing has boomed since then, and certainly research on digital food marketing has increased rapidly over that period. So we're capturing more of that now, obviously, in the review than had been known previously. And essentially, we were looking for any studies that compared exposure to food or beverage marketing to no exposure, less exposure, or less powerful exposure, and looking at either measured food intake or survey data, self-reported data, as long as there was a clear comparison between those who'd watched more and those who'd watched less marketing. We were able to do some meta-analyses. So where studies are sufficiently similar, we can sort of throw them together and look at what their combined results say. And that was able to tell us that greater exposure to food marketing led to greater food intake. So whether that's calories, grams, items, greater choice of test items. So if children have been exposed to food marketing, they're more likely to choose the advertised products, but also products within that sort of advertised category. So, for example, they're more likely to choose fast food if they've just been exposed to fast food advertising. And also greater preference. So we included measures of taste preference. So, for example, a child might be asked to taste 2 products and say which tastes better to you. But also brand preference. So children can kind of rate their liking of or rank their liking of brands. And that preference was improved with greater food marketing compared to less. We also found evidence that product requests or the tester power is increased by exposure to marketing as well. So children are more likely to request that caregivers purchase products for them if they've been exposed to more food marketing. But the issues come with measuring those sort of longer term outcomes, of course, like we looked at dental health, body weight, and also diet related non-communicable disease. And there's very little on any of those. It's just such a challenging thing to measure because, of course, we all know, there are multiple drivers of weight gain. There are multiple drivers of all the NCDs as well. So it's relatively unsurprising that we're not seeing masses of data showing direct relationships between those two. Not to say that they don't exist, but just that it's methodologically it's that much more challenging to pick up.
I mean, also the length of the studies as well would not really give you the time, to be able to see if there was a clear sort of association or not. I mean, like you say, just so many drivers. But yeah, hopefully you will find, later on with continued research. Or is that me? My
Yeah, the internet slowed down a little bit there, but I mean, it's getting sort of longitudinal studies that can track exposure over time and look for changes in body weight across, a cohort of children are possible. They're just expensive and require a lot of, researcher time and everything else. And it depends how broad you go in the measurement of food marketing exposure as well. TV exposure is sort of relatively easy to track. Exposure to digital food marketing is that bit more challenging. So it's kind of, it's not impossible, but that's where the limitations or the gaps in the evidence are. Although you've probably seen some of the studies we've done that have shown, for example, that if children consume more food after food marketing, they don't then compensate for that by eating less later. So the indications are there that food marketing drives intake, but also does it in a way that would lead to weight gain if, based on kind of continual exposure and if children continue to respond. So the evidence is building to link food marketing with body weight outcomes, but it's more limited than we have for kind of immediate dietary outcomes such as choice, preference, and intake.
And then there's what about food policies? What is the effect on that? So you've done that systematic review as well.
Yeah, so that was looking at implemented policies that have sought to restrict food and beverage marketing to children. So that includes both kind of mandatory government-led policies, but also the voluntary measures. So where the food industry will say, we've got this pledge or we've got this self-regulatory approach where we're going to restrict, we're not going to advertise under 12s or whatever. So we were looking at any of those that have been implemented, not any, not plans or not intentions to, but where they have been implemented, and found studies that have explored whether or not they've had an impact on a range of outcomes. So we found that policies such as those can have an impact on exposure, so it can reduce the prevalence essentially of food marketing. It can reduce the power of food marketing. So, for example, if promotional characters are restricted in a policy, the volume of use of promotional characters in unhealthy food marketing can reduce effectively. We found some evidence that it can affect change to expenditure on food marketing, which is supported by the fact that prevalence is reduced. So it can shift spend within the sector towards other products and away from food marketing. But it's really, really challenging again to pick up any specific effects. So there's the odd study, one or two studies that have looked at whether diet has changed following implementation of a food marketing policy and so on, but it's really too soon to draw firm conclusions. And that again is part of this issue about how do you measure something like a secular trend like obesity and something with so many factors, but also that often the policies that we're talking about were implemented a long time ago, or people didn't have enough, researchers didn't know in advance that the policy was going to happen when it happened. So, natural experiments and things that might be kind of really neatly applied before and after policy implementation weren't possible. So you're left kind of comparing a regulated territory to a non-regulated territory, or, households that are more likely to experience a restriction to households that aren't in different places. And that comes with its own challenges.
So where do you think, sorry?
No, so I was just going to say, there's evidence that food marketing policies can be effective, but it comes down to a lot of the time the design of that policy. So we found that mandatory policies that are government-led and apply across the board are more likely to be effective than these voluntary measures that are led by the food industry, which is what you would expect, because it's their commercial bottom line. They're not terribly good at cutting out their profits. And that it comes down to specific elements of the design of the policy, like, for example, policies that are seeking to protect children older than 12 as well. So, acknowledging that adolescents are also vulnerable, they're more likely to be more effective than policies that just focus on younger children. Right. And those that use a nutrient profile model as an evidence-based way of categorizing foods are more likely to be effective than those that rely on kind of relatively arbitrary thresholds in terms of the nutrient values that can be in foods before they're restricted.
What about maybe I'm getting into, what about the way they deliver? Not, the way they deliver it, is it like, sort of like, is it specific to sort of gender based, that sort of thing? Is it, or is it just more generalized? Do they take in all those factors? Big companies, do they apply differences or not to try and get the right sort of base, or are they just sort of across the line for everybody?
I think it differs. I think marketers are very, very smart, especially with digital marketing. We all know how it's personalized and targeted to the groups that are most likely to respond, and in the moments where they're most likely to respond as well. It's just that there are limitations on what the evidence can say. So we weren't able to do any real kind of meaningful comparisons between kind of like SES or any kind of personal factors like gender and kind of higher middle income countries or lower income countries, because the data is all from a kind of homogenous group. It tends to come from the UK, Australia, Canada, increasingly from Chile and places that are taking action and doing lots of evaluation. But just, the data either doesn't exist to enable those, or it wasn't reported in such a way that we can break it down quite that precisely. But I'm sure the marketing itself is very,
very sophisticated
targeted in terms of the demographic it's seeking to reach.
Yeah. So where do you see this sort of going? I mean, what do you what will be sort of the WHO recommendations on this based on these results, and the groups sort of working towards this? When are they going to be released, and where what do you think will be the results or the recommendations?
The guidelines, the draft guidelines were released for public consultation just a few days ago, the start of July. So there's a period of consultation where they've drafted guidelines based on the reviews, and they're looking now for feedback in terms of how well people feel that they fit the evidence, where they think they could be stronger, where they think that it's not supported, and so on. And then, they continue with the guideline development process. But I think this is the last step, I believe, before they will be finalized based on the feedback.
How do you feel about them?
I think it's difficult because the guideline development process requires us to use this grade categorization of evidence certainty.
Yeah.
And the difficulty with grade is that it really is designed for RCTs and kind of clinical trials where you can have a very controlled setting, and that doesn't necessarily apply to things like policies. The real world studies that you can't randomize somebody to the placebo arm of a national policy, essentially. So grade automatically kind of feels less certain about them, and that's how it has to get rated. So a lot of the evidence comes out as less certain as a result, which then has led into the guidelines that kind of are trying not to go further than the evidence, because they want it all to be evidence-based. So I feel like people might want the guidelines to be stronger than the draft suggests, but that maybe, if that comes through the feedback, then it would be interesting to see if that's reflected in the final version.
And how do you think, countries will react? Because I mean, it's more of a country sort of situation, isn't it? Because because of the implementation of policies, how will they react? Will these recommendations really serve to make changes? And how do you see that playing?
I mean, I think a lot of countries are already discussing about this, and things like the guidelines and the evidence that underpins them, I think, will be useful to countries to kind of say there is a justification for this. The evidence keeps growing. It's no matter which way you cut it, there's more evidence than there was 10 years ago, and it's starting to reflect the different, the digital routes, for example, through which young people in particular are targeted. And I think that a lot of it, countries are looking at places like the UK or Canada or Chile or other places that are taking action on food marketing and looking at what they're doing and thinking about how that might work in their jurisdiction. But also just the fact that these processes are in motion, I think, are putting a little bit of pressure on the platforms themselves as well. So we already had Google a couple of years ago announcing that it was generating its own policy on food marketing to minors within the EU and the UK. And I think that although a lot of the policies will need to be national, I think there's a supranational issue here as well, isn't there, with things like digital marketing that don't fit neatly into national borders. So I think just continuing to keep this issue as a high priority and kind of, out there in people's consciousness, I think is keeping it on the agenda.
There's a very fine line, between being this sort of global super, but above kind of countries, and also trying to get, your company to continue to make a lot of money from the advertising. So how much regulation do you really want to put in there?
Well, this is when it comes down to the relative might of the two bodies, doesn't it? But I think they come under pressure as well. So groups like Facebook, if the public start to en masse not believe that they are taking reasonable steps to protect children, for example, then their business model can very quickly get damaged anyway. So it might be that they, are willing to make certain changes in order to kind of protect their the faith that people have in them and so on. So they're never going to suddenly say, right, we'll take away all of the food marketing, but I think incremental gains and steps towards it can only be a good thing.
So basically you're saying that we need to sort of work like from the ground up, because you'd need sort of like more involvement of just from the general public, in order to say, we don't want this to be sort of, merchandised or publicized for our kids. We don't want this damaging, unhealthy food to be part of, our marketing, the marketing strategies. So we would need more involvement. Would that be one possibility?
Yeah, I think public pressure always plays a part, doesn't it? Whether that's policymakers within country or on these platforms. I don't think any one government could speak to Google and say you have to act, and they would do it. But if the people power does work to an extent, so
we might have to get a bit more involved, though. But then it also means that you've got to cut down yourself, on a personal individual basis, or on what you decide that you're going to consume as well. And it's not just sort of ultra processed foods. It might like just high fat and sugar sweetened beverages and stuff is fine, but I think individually you really have to sort of make a decision, will I stop buying those products as well? And that sometimes can be a bit tricky.
It absolutely can be, and I think that's the whole point, in a sense, that if we're relying on kind of individual purchasing decisions and willpower and so on, the food environment has to shift around us for that to be workable, right? So if you're in a situation where all you have available are healthy options, and I'm not saying always, but I'm not denying the fact that we need to have, treats are nice and they can exist, but the food environment has gone too far the other way. So it's almost impossible to ever have anything other than the less healthy stuff. So let's kind of start shifting the balance back the other way, right? And if the provisions available that are mostly around you are affordable and healthy, then those are the choices that you'll make without requiring that strong conscious to do so, because it will just be kind of conducive to the environment,
sort of more automatic and more habitual and more So what would be your recommendations as sort of health professionals? How do we what strategies should we use to apply some form of, I was going to say wage a war against advertising, but that might not be the right strategy.
I think when we talk particularly about digital marketing, and there's always a tendency to sort of say, reduce screen time for children, but it's such a shame that should have to be the solution. I mean, I think that, reasonable limits on screen time are a good thing. Of course, we shouldn't spend our lives stuck to a screen. But equally, the internet is a huge beneficial resource for young people. And, we saw during the pandemic quite how valuable it is for social connection and education and everything else. And so it shouldn't be that the onus is on parents or health professionals or young people to regulate their behavior to that extent. But I just think parents need to be aware, and so health professionals need to advise as well, where possible, that this is part of what is driving those health behaviors. So if a child is struggling with their eating behavior and with their weight, we need to factor the time that they're spending on commercial media into that conversation, and suggesting, whether they realize they've seen it or not, we know it acts subconsciously and people don't always remember. But it will be kind of reinforcing messages that unhealthy foods are fun, they're tasty. These are the brands that are, implicit in your mind with positive connections and so on. So it needs to be factored in. And I don't believe in individual approaches. I think that it's a job for governments to regulate that environment so that it is a healthy space to go to. But building kind of critical awareness in both families, parents and young children, to help them understand that those food companies are not your friend. The food might taste good, but there are consequences to that as well, and that's what the marketing doesn't tell you.
Yeah, exactly. And where do you see sort of like future research going in this area, specifically just around policies, or what work should be continued?
I think there's a lot of work going on at the moment to really try to get a good quality set of data in terms of digital food marketing exposure. We've got lots of different approaches being used now. It's a different challenge to TV because we don't all see the same stuff. So it's not just a case of going to popular programs or a certain channel and recording it and seeing what's on. Now it's different from my screen to a child's screen and your screen. So there are a lot of different methods being developed and trialed in order to make that methodology more robust and give us kind of, triangulate data from lots of different sources and put that together to get a better sense of what's out there. I think that's only going to increase and improve. So we'll get more and more validated measures, and those being applied in research more to get data from different populations and so on. And of course that moves as well because technology develops. So you've probably heard of the metaverse and the next stage of the internet. It's all going to be really immersed even more, and virtual reality worlds and all of this sort of stuff, and marketing is already there. So there's going to be a constant need to innovate those methods in order to try to keep up and try to keep getting the data that's informative for policymakers. But as we've said, I think some of those big longitudinal trials will happen as well, where we're getting a better sense of kind of tracking weight and exposure over time and seeing if we can start to do some more complete measurements to isolate out the impact of marketing from all the other factors, and so on and so on. Although I don't think that we should need to have direct evidence of food marketing affecting obesity in order to take action. I think the fact that it affects immediate food choice decisions and intake decisions would therefore affect diet quality is enough. Diet quality we know is already associated with health outcomes. So I don't think we should sort of tie ourselves in knots trying to show that it drives obesity, because I think that's probably a hiding to nothing, because it can always be criticised that there's some other factor we haven't measured that's driving the effect and so on.
Says the expert, okay?
The food industry will always say, where's that evidence that it directly affects obesity? And it's a straw man's argument really that we shouldn't be drawn into. But equally, I think that we can look back over 30 years and say this is one of the factors that has contributed to the massive increase in rates of overweight and obesity across the globe.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that if we just sit there and, base our, choice of foods, selection on whether you have or not enough evidence and grading, on these recommendations, I think it's a bit of a waste of time, especially when you landed on the individual. But anyway, how popular are you with the food industry?
Not especially.
Have you had your run-ins?
I've had a few exchanges on Twitter and so on. It's always an interesting area to research. I'll say that. It's never a dull moment.
I'll leave it at that. And basically, if people want to get hold of you, and I will link, your Twitter mainly, which is where I think you're most active. Is that right?
Yes, that's where I tend to publicize the research I'm working on and things.
Yeah, as well as your run-ins.
Yes.
I'll put links as well to these two reviews that we've just commented on. And I really want to thank you for your time, being here and being able to talk about this subject. It's just important to, to be able, maybe people don't have, not everyone has the opportunity to talk to the researchers involved doing this work. And it's just really nice to sort of turn you into a human being and be able to see you and the work that you're doing. And I thank you for your time, Emma, for being here on the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been fun.
I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to sort of say just to finish off.
Oh, I'm sure I could keep talking for a good long time about all of this, but just to say, I'll be happy to hear from anyone who needs more information or has projects on the go that I could contribute to in some way, because it's certainly not going away anytime soon.
No.
So it's an area that is ripe for plenty more research. So I'm looking forward to doing some of it.
Well, what's really good is that it'll keep you busy for a long time.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
Thank you so much, Emma. And to all of our listeners, please remember to like this episode, to comment, to share it. And that way we can disseminate science. So just remember that we continue to nourish each other, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Gracias por escuchar un episodio más de Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. No olvides dejar un comentario, suscribirte al canal y presionar el botón de notificaciones. Ayúdanos a crecer. Y recuerda, nos seguimos nutriendo.